The final solution we want to look at is document management. And what does cloud have to do with document management? You may be thinking, I already have a document management system on premise. Why would I need the cloud for document management? And it's related in three ways. One is that some document management systems can actually be hosted in the cloud or connected to cloud repositories. And that second bit is very, very related to number two, because if I can connect my document management system to cloud repositories, then maybe it's cheaper to store my files in the cloud than in an on-premise file server, especially for three, long-term archival of files, files that I'm not going to be accessing on a regular basis, that I can simply throw out into the depths of cold storage to just wait out the retention period there. And I use a term there that I'd like to explain, cold storage. So when you purchase storage from a cloud provider, there are things known as access tiers. And there are many of them. They change their names based on the provider. But we want to talk about three. We're going to talk about hot storage, cool storage, and archive storage. Hot storage typically has a higher cost per gigabyte. However, when you read or write files to storage, there's also a cost for those operations. That's known as a per transaction cost. So hot storage will have higher per gigabyte costs, but lower per transaction costs. Cool storage will have a lower per gigabyte cost, but a higher per transaction cost. Cool storage will also have some requirements as to how long I need to leave files stored there. Finally, there's archive storage. And archive storage has the lowest, and I do mean dirt cheap per gigabyte costs, but it has sky high per transaction costs. And so archive storage, as its name would imply, is typically left for files that I know I'm not really going to need, and that I only need to hang on to for retention period purposes. So looking at these ways that document management is related to cloud, why would Azure be useful for document management? Well, really, it's because you can build upon your current solution. And that's going to be the biggest advantage here for document management. And so maybe you start simply by eliminating your on-premise file servers and replacing them with hot and cool storage in Azure. But maybe then you also integrate your on-premise identities with cloud identities using that Azure Active Directory sync. Well, guess what? The permissions that you had on your local file server, where Nestor could only access these three files, when Big Boss Joe can offer or can access all the file shares, those same permissions can be extended to these new file shares that are in the cloud. I can go a step further and add a layer of automation and say, hey, if a file isn't accessed at least once every 6 months, move that into cold storage because it's cheaper for me. I can say, hey, if a file isn't accessed once in a year, move that into archive storage. And I can then add this layer of automation that helps me keep my costs down. What if I then decide to host my document management system in the cloud? Or if I decide to connect it to these repositories? What if I decide to go a step further and add artificial intelligence to automatically read data from certain documents and perform a business process, or to assist my team in cataloging large volumes of documents? Or I decide to build an analytics solution that looks at the metadata of my file and gives my document management or compliance teams key insights about what files I'm storing. Or a web application that allows my employees or my customers to access certain files related to their accounts or to their own processes. Again, the possibilities are endless, and that's the real advantage of being able to do or to leverage cloud for document management, is that you can continue to build upon these solutions. But what's the damage going to be? Well, this is the area where we probably have the greatest variability, because it really depends on what tiers I'm using and what volume of files are living in those tiers. We've made a couple of assumptions here. So we have 1 terabyte of data in hot storage, and that same 1 terabyte of data being backed up. That costs me around $85 a month. We have 1 terabyte of data in cool storage. And as we mentioned, cool storage has a commitment you have to make to keep your files in that type of storage. You have to keep files in cold storage for at least 3 months. If you don't, then there is an early deletion fee. And I've assumed that maybe 100 gigs out of those we will delete early. There's also a fee and a higher cost for actually reading that data. So I've assumed that from cool storage, it's typically things we don't touch often. So maybe I'm only going to read about 100 gigabytes of data there. That costs me about $71 a month. Now for archive storage, I've assumed 2 terabytes of data. Now, as you mentioned, this has the highest costs for data retrieval. And if I want to read data from archive, I have to perform what's known as a rehydration. That essentially means I have to click a button and wait up to 6 hours before my data is available. If I don't want to wait that time, I can do a high priority read, but that's typically very expensive. And so I've assumed I'm only going to do around 10 gigabytes of regular data retrieval and only around 1 gigabyte of high priority data retrieval. And that would cost me around $33 a month. Now, one area that's very, very variable for my files, especially if I have large volumes of files, is bandwidth. So if I'm storing video, if I'm storing Photoshop files, Premiere files, Illustrator files, and I'm pulling these down from the cloud all the time, then maybe that bandwidth cost starts to go up. And so notice that for 1 gigabyte of egress, that comes up instead of the simple $7 that we had seen before to around $70. And so it's one thing we want to monitor closely. What that means is that of all the solutions we've seen, maybe document management is the most complex one to actually deploy. It's fairly simple to get started with it, and it can still be done in a week or two, but it may be a bit more unpredictable than the other workloads. So how can we still call this a quick win? Well, it's because by working with Inova, we can do what's called as a proof of concept. And in many cases, we can actually get funding to cover all the costs of this proof of concept. And what we can do is deploy a small scale version of the solution for, say, a 1-month period, have you and your employees try it, see how it works. And that will give us, number one, a good idea of how it would work in production and what the quality of the service would be. But also, number two, a very good idea of how much it's going to cost you and a number that you can use to compare against, say, running this on-premise. Well, those are the 5 quick wins we wanted to look at. So what's next? Well, we've looked at many tables that have pricing, and what we'd like to do is encourage you to check our math. So there are 3 resources in the slide, and we're actually going to give you access to these slides further ahead, so you'll be able to access these links. Now, most of these tables were generated with this Azure Calculator resource. That'll take you to a page in the Azure website where you can actually rebuild those same tables with those same specifications and check that the prices are the same for your region. But what's very, very interesting is that second link, the Azure Total Cost of Ownership Calculator. Because what that link does is it asks me for more information about my geography and my organization. It asks me for things like my cost per kilowatt hour for energy. It asks me for things like my cost for internet for my ISP. It asks me for things like costs for my buildings and my maintenance. And so it allows me to take a look at the total cost of actually keeping servers on premise, not just the price of the servers, but also the price of keeping them up and running, and compare that against running in the cloud for 1, 3, or 5 years. Sometimes the on-premise will be cheaper. Sometimes the cloud will be cheaper. But you have the tool there to understand which of these is right for you. And for our techies, we haven't forgotten about you. We know you're the majority today. So we want to share that third bonus resource is the Azure Charts Solution Explorer. This is a website maintained by a Microsoft MVP, and the Solution Explorer specifically has tiles that relate to each Azure service. As you click a tile, other tiles will highlight to show you how, say, storage is typically related to identity. And as you click more and more tiles, a dropdown will actually populate with reference architecture for specific solutions. So if you click storage and identity, you may get an option within that dropdown that says replacing your on-premise file servers with Azure files. And clicking on that option, I do apologize for the neighbor's rooster who's really excited. Clicking on that option will actually take you to a Microsoft Docs link where you will see a reference architecture, what tools specifically you need to deploy, what services, what VMs, how you need to deploy and configure them in order to get the solution up and running.